You know, life has a funny way of catching you off guard. One moment, you're just going through the motions, laundry, dishes, a little TV before bed, and the next, it feels like the ground beneath you crumbles. That's what happened to me. I never thought the most shocking moment of my life would happen in a bathroom, of all places. But that's where it all started. Or maybe it started long before that, and I just didn't notice. You ever look back and wonder how many red flags you ignored? How many little signs you brushed off because they were too small, too inconvenient to deal with? Yeah, me too. That day started out normal. Completely normal. I was wiping down the bathroom sink. It's this habit of mine. No matter how chaotic things are, I always like the bathroom to feel clean. It's my little sanctuary. Or, at least, it used to be. The light was streaming in through the frosted glass, the kind of soft light that makes you pause for a second and think about how quiet your house feels. Too quiet. And then there was the knock. It wasn't a loud knock. Just a soft, almost hesitant tap on the door. At first, I didn't even look up. Yeah? I called out, half distracted, wiping some toothpaste off the faucet. No response. Just another knock. This one a little firmer, like whoever was on the other side was working up the courage to speak. Come in, I said, thinking it was nothing. Probably someone looking for their phone charger or a towel. I didn't even think to glance at the mirror to see who it might be. But then, there he was. Sam, my stepgrandson, standing in the doorway, his face. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't his usual goofy grin or the slightly bored look he'd get when his parents were nagging him. It was something else, serious, curious, maybe even nervous. Hey, he said, his voice soft. Hey yourself, I replied, smiling without thinking. What's up? And that's when he said it. It wasn't what he said exactly, at least, not at first. It was the way he said it. Quiet, but with this weight, like he'd been rehearsing it in his head over and over. Like he wasn't sure how I'd react. I remember the way my stomach flipped. You know that feeling? That split second when your brain starts to process something before you even fully understand it? A kind of instinct, like your body knows before your mind does? That was me. I froze. The air in the room shifted. I felt it, thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I just stood there, staring at him, trying to make sense of it all. Looking back, I think that's the moment my life changed. Not when I opened the door. Not when I let him speak. But in that exact moment, standing there in the bathroom, when I realized. I didn't know where this was going, but I knew it wasn't going to end well. And you know what's funny? I thought I was prepared for anything. I thought I knew myself, my limits, my boundaries. Turns out you never really know. You never really know what you're capable of until the moment presents itself. It's been 2 years since that day. 2 years of replaying every second, every word, every look. And let me tell you, some moments haunt you forever. But I guess if you're still watching, you want to hear the rest, don't you? Well, buckle up. Because this isn't a story about right and wrong. It's about what happens when life takes a turn you never saw coming. You know, it's funny how routines can feel so comforting and so suffocating at the same time. My life was fine. Not bad, not great. Just fine. And sometimes, fine can be the loneliest place to live. My husband, Robert, was the kind of man people describe as dependable. A good provider. The steady rock of the family. But dependable can sometimes turn into distant. And steady can feel like absence. He worked hard, long hours at his job, always bringing his laptop to the dinner table, his phone buzzing late into the night. He'd tell me it was all for us, for the family, and I believed him. I still do, I guess. But the truth? Somewhere along the way, I stopped being part of his priorities. I don't think he even noticed when I stopped trying to get his attention. The little touches, the hints, the questions about his day, they all faded into the background, like white noise. And me? I felt like I was disappearing. Our blended family had its fair share of ups and downs, like any other. I'd been married before, and so had Robert. Between us, we'd created this patchwork of lives, kids, stepkids, and eventually step-grandkids. There were moments of connection, laughter, and warmth. But there was always this undercurrent of something missing. Like a puzzle with a piece that didn't quite fit, no matter how hard you pressed it into place. And then there was Sam, my step-grandson. Sam was different. He had this energy about him, this spark that lit up the room. He wasn't just another teenager glued to his phone. He noticed things most people overlooked. Like the way I always folded towels a certain way, or how I hummed to myself when I was cooking. He'd make these little comments that caught me off guard, like, "You're the only one who makes this house feel alive, you know that?" At first, I thought it was sweet. Just a young man with a good heart, saying kind things. And maybe that's all it was. But in a house that often felt more like a waiting room than a home, those small moments of attention felt like oxygen to someone gasping for air. Our house was cozy in the way old houses are: creaky floorboards, chipped paint on the windowsills, and a fireplace that only worked when it wanted to. It wasn't perfect, but it had character. Still, for all its charm, the house carried this eerie kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind. I'd sit in the living room some nights, listening to the clock tick and wonder if anyone else felt it. That weight of unspoken words, unresolved emotions, the slow drift of people living under the same roof but miles apart. Sam, though, he seemed immune to it. He'd burst through the front door with his skateboard under one arm, his face lit up with some story about his day. He brought life into the house in a way that none of us could. He had this way of making you feel like you mattered, like you were seen. It's embarrassing to admit now, but I looked forward to the times he'd visit. Not because I thought anything of it, not then, but because it broke the monotony. He made me laugh. He made me feel young again, like the version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. And yet, even with Sam's energy, the house always returned to its default state: quiet. Too quiet. I remember thinking how strange it was to feel lonely in a house full of people. But that was my life, a series of quiet days, quiet nights, and an even quieter marriage. I told myself it was normal. That this was just how things were when you'd been married for years, when life got busy, when kids and grandkids took up all the space that used to belong to the two of you. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was missing. I just didn't know how far that emptiness would take me. And then came that knock on the bathroom door. Looking back, I realize now that moment wasn't just about what Sam said or did. It was about what it awakened in me. A feeling I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. But the thing about feelings? They don't care about right or wrong. They don't care about boundaries or consequences. They just exist, like a fire waiting for a spark. And Sam, he was that spark. It started with a knock. I was scrubbing the bathroom sink, wiping away little toothpaste smudges and water stains, lost in my thoughts like I often was during these quiet moments. The house was alive with its usual creaks and groans, but otherwise silent. I liked it that way sometimes. It was one of the few spaces where I could just breathe. The knock was soft, hesitant even, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they should disturb me. I assumed it was a simple question, someone needing a towel or asking where something was. I didn't think much of it. "Come in," I called, my voice casual, distracted. The door opened slowly, and there stood Sam, leaning slightly against the frame. He looked different, though I couldn't put my finger on why at first. There was no skateboard tucked under his arm, no infectious grin plastered across his face. Instead, his expression was searching. "Hey," he said quietly, almost unsure. "Hey yourself," I replied, smiling as I turned back to rinse the rag in the sink. "What's up?" He stepped into the room, shutting the door behind him. That caught my attention. It was such a small gesture, but the sound of the latch clicking felt loud in the silence. I looked up, a little puzzled. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor for a moment before meeting mine. And then he said it. I think I need to tell you something." There was a weight in his voice that made my stomach tighten. Not fear exactly, but a kind of unease. The kind that creeps up on you when you realize a moment is about to take a turn you're not ready for. "Okay," I said slowly, setting the rag down and turning to face him fully. "What's on your mind?" He stepped closer, just a small step, but it felt like he was closing a gap I didn't even know existed. His gaze didn't waver this time. "It's just, you're always so nice to me," he started, his voice soft but steady. "I don't think you realize how much that means." I felt a flicker of something I couldn't name rise in my chest. I laughed nervously, trying to deflect whatever was happening. "Of course I'm nice to you. You're family, Sam." He smiled, but it wasn't his usual carefree grin. It was smaller, almost sad. "Yeah, but it's more than that. You actually listen to me. You care. I don't think anyone else really does." His words hit me harder than I expected. There was a sincerity in them, a rawness that made me feel seen. And that scared me. "Sam," I said, my voice firmer this time, trying to reestablish some kind of boundary I didn't even know we'd crossed. "I'm always here for you. You know that, right? But if there's something you're feeling, something you're struggling with, we can talk about it. You don't have to carry it alone." For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. I thought he'd nod, thank me, and leave. But instead, he stepped even closer, his eyes locked on mine. "You're the only one who makes me feel like I matter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The air in the room shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. A line had been crossed, and there was no pretending otherwise. "Sam," I started, but my voice faltered. I didn't know what to say. He reached out, not to touch me, but just enough to close the distance even further. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his words tumbling out as if he couldn't stop them. "I don't mean to make you uncomfortable. I needed you to know." My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. I wanted to tell him to leave, to give us both the space to breathe, to think. But I didn't move. Instead, I stood there, frozen in that moment, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me, something I wasn't ready to confront. Looking back, I realize now that moment was the tipping point. It wasn't the words themselves, or even the way he looked at me. It was what it revealed about me. About the loneliness I'd been carrying, the emptiness I'd been ignoring. And as much as I wanted to brush it off, to tell myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Foreshadowing is funny like that. It's always so clear in hindsight. Those lingering gazes, the curious questions, the way he always seemed to notice the things no one else did. I'd seen it all before, but I chose to ignore it. And now? Now, I couldn't. I shut the bathroom door behind him after he left, my hand lingering on the cold doorknob longer than it should have. My mind was a whirlwind, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if all the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on me. I sank down onto the closed toilet seat, staring blankly at the tiled floor. My mind replayed his words, his expression, over and over like a broken record. "You're the only one who makes me feel like I matter." Why did that hit me so hard? Why couldn't I just laugh it off like it was nothing? It should have been nothing. He was a teenager, for God's sake. Probably just feeling misunderstood, like most kids his age. But it wasn't just his words, it was the way he said them, the way he looked at me. It was different. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to shake the feeling that had taken root deep inside me. But it was stubborn, refusing to let go. Why did this feel so off? I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just an awkward moment blown out of proportion by my own restless mind. But then I thought about the way he lingered in the doorway, the way his eyes searched mine like he was waiting for something, for me to say something, do something. And that was the part one couldn't let go of. The part that made my stomach churn and my chest tighten. Because deep down, I wasn't sure if I was unsettled by him, or by myself. It wasn't the first time someone had made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. But why him? And why now? I'd been married to Robert for almost a decade. He was good to me in all the practical ways, a provider, a steady presence. But the connection we once had, the spark, had long since faded into the background. He didn't look at me the way Sam had just looked at me. And that was what scared me most. I told myself it was just loneliness. A fleeting moment of weakness brought on by years of feeling invisible. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more they clawed their way back, digging into every quiet moment I had to myself. That night, as I lay in bed next to Robert, the house dark and silent, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Robert was fast asleep, his soft snores filling the room, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I tried to imagine telling him about what had happened, about what Sam had said, the way he'd said it. But the thought felt impossible. How could I explain something I didn't even understand myself? My mind wandered to Sam, his face, his words, the way he made me feel like I mattered. I hated myself for even thinking it, but there was a small part of me, buried deep under layers of guilt and rationality, that craved that feeling. The days that followed were a strange dance of avoidance and overthinking. Every time I saw Sam, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. He acted normal, maybe a little quieter than usual, but otherwise the same. And that only made things worse. I found myself analyzing every interaction, every word, every look. Was I imagining things? Was it all in my head? Or was there something unspoken lingering between us? The tension was subtle, but it was there. Like a faint hum in the background, always present, always pulling at my thoughts. I hated it, but I couldn't ignore it. I started rationalizing, justifying my feelings in ways that felt both ridiculous and terrifying. Maybe I was reading too much into it because I was lonely. Maybe it wasn't about him at all, but about what he represented, a reminder that I was still a person, still capable of being noticed, still worthy of attention. And yet, every time I convinced myself it was nothing, a small voice in the back of my mind would whisper, "But what if it's not?" The house became a minefield of emotions I couldn't navigate. Every glance, every word, every moment alone with Sam felt charged with a tension I couldn't quite place. I started avoiding him as much as I could, keeping conversations short, finding excuses to leave the room whenever he walked in. But it didn't help. If anything, it only made things worse. The distance made the moments we did interact feel sharper, more intense. Late at night, I'd sit in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace the only light in the house, and replay everything in my head. I wanted to talk to someone, to unload the weight of what I was feeling, but who could I tell? I didn't even know what I was feeling. Guilt? Confusion? Longing? I wanted to believe it was nothing. Just a passing moment of vulnerability that would fade with time. But the truth was, I wasn't sure. And that uncertainty was eating me alive. The days that followed were like walking a tightrope over a chasm I couldn't see the bottom of. Everything felt heavier, sharper, like the air itself carried the weight of unspoken words. I tried to pretend things were normal, but normal was long gone. It started small, little things that I told myself meant nothing. Like the way Sam would linger a little longer in the kitchen when I was making dinner, leaning against the counter as if he had nowhere else to be. His questions seemed more pointed, more personal. "How was your day?" he'd ask, and I'd feel a strange twist in my stomach because he looked like he genuinely wanted to know. Same as always, I'd reply with a smile that felt too forced. But it wasn't just the questions. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Like he was studying me, searching for something I wasn't sure I wanted him to find. I told myself it was all in my head. That I was reading too much into things because of that moment in the bathroom. But then there were the jokes. One night, I was washing dishes while Sam sat at the table scrolling through his phone. Robert was in the living room, half asleep in front of the TV. Sam suddenly said, "You know, you're the only person I know who can make even dishwashing look elegant." I laughed, rolling my eyes. "Oh, please. It's just soap and water." "No, really," he insisted, his tone playful, but with that same undercurrent I'd been trying to ignore. "You have this grace about you. It's kind of amazing." I felt my face flush, and I quickly turned back to the sink, focusing on the soapy water. "You're ridiculous," I said, trying to keep my tone light. But my hands were shaking. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Like he wanted me to believe them. Like he needed me to. And then there was the touch. It happened one afternoon when we were all out in the backyard. Robert was grilling, the smell of charcoal and sizzling meat filling the air, and I was setting the table on the patio. Sam came over to help, carrying a stack of plates. "Need a hand?" he asked, and before I could answer, he stepped closer, brushing against me as he set the plates down. It was barely a touch, just his arm against mine, but it sent a jolt through me that I wasn't prepared for. I froze for a second, my heart pounding, before quickly stepping back. "Thanks," I said, my voice too high, too quick. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with that same unreadable expression, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I tried to laugh it off, to pretend I didn't feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but inside, I was unraveling. And then, as if the universe was conspiring against me, Robert started to notice. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening as we were getting ready for bed. "Have I?" I replied, forcing a smile as I folded a pair of socks. "Yeah," he said, his brow furrowed. "Is something bothering you?" "No, of course not," I lied, my voice too bright. "I've just been tired. That's all." He didn't look convinced, but he let it go, turning back to his phone. But the truth was, I was crumbling. Every moment with Sam felt like a test I was failing. Every glance, every word, every brush of skin felt like a step closer to a line I knew I couldn't cross. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to create distance. If anything, I found myself leaning into those moments, seeking them out in ways I didn't want to admit. One evening, we were in the kitchen again, just the two of us. Robert was in his office, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Sam was sitting on the counter, swinging his legs like a kid, and we were talking about nothing in particular, his school, his friends, the latest movie he wanted to see. And then he said, "You're different, you know." "Different how?" I asked, glancing at him as I wiped down the counter. "Different from everyone else," he said, his tone serious now. "You actually care. You don't just go through the motions like everyone else." I didn't know what to say. His words felt too heavy, too close to something I wasn't ready to face. "I think you give me too much credit," I said, forcing a laugh. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I mean it." The way he looked at me then, with so much intensity, made my chest tighten. I had to look away. The boundaries between us were blurring, and I didn't know how to stop it. Or if I even wanted to. The tension was becoming impossible to ignore, and I could feel it spilling over into the rest of the family. Robert's questions, the way he watched me a little more closely, the way Sam seemed to find excuses to be near me, all of it was building, brick by brick, into something I couldn't escape. And yet, I didn't stop it. I didn't know how. Or maybe I just didn't want to. It happened late one night. The house was silent, wrapped in the kind of stillness that comes when everyone else is asleep, and you're the only one left awake with your thoughts. I was in the kitchen, sipping a glass of water, trying to calm my racing mind. The day had been uneventful on the surface, but beneath it, I could feel the tension building, like a storm brewing just out of sight. I heard the knock on the doorframe before I saw him. It was soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. I turned to see Sam standing there, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie, his face shadowed by the dim light. "Can't sleep?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, though my chest tightened at the sight of him. He shook his head, stepping into the kitchen. "Neither can you, I guess." I nodded, taking another sip of water, feeling the weight of his presence as he moved closer. He sat down at the table, resting his elbows on it, his gaze fixed on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Then he broke it. "I need to say something," he said, his voice low but steady. I froze, my heart pounding. "Sam, maybe now isn't, please," he interrupted, his eyes meeting mine with a kind of desperation that made my breath catch. "Just let me say this." I nodded slowly, setting the glass down on the counter and leaning against it for support. "You're the only person who makes me feel like I'm not invisible," he began, his words spilling out in a rush. "Like I'm more than just some kid everyone tolerates. You actually see me." "Sam," I started, but he held up a hand, stopping me. No, just listen, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I know this is complicated. I know I shouldn't feel this way. But I can't help it. You mean more to me than anyone ever has, and I don't know how to handle that. My chest tightened, the air feeling too thick to breathe. His words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over me and pulling me under. I wanted to stop him, to tell him to leave, to end this before it went any further. But I couldn't move. He stood then, taking a step closer, and I felt my back press against the counter. You make me feel alive, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Like I matter. And I don't know what to do with that, because it scares me. But what scares me more is the thought of never telling you. Tears welled up in my eyes, a mix of guilt, fear, and something I couldn't name. Sam, this isn't right, I said, my voice shaking. We can't, I know, he said quickly, his own eyes glistening. I know. But that doesn't change how I feel. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The world outside the kitchen disappeared, and it was just the two of us, caught in a moment neither of us knew how to escape. And then he reached out, his hand brushing mine. It was a small gesture, barely a touch, but it sent a shockwave through me. I pulled my hand away, tears spilling over as I shook my head. Sam, please. This has to stop. He stepped back, his expression crumbling. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to, I held up a hand, cutting him off. You need to go. Please. He hesitated, his shoulders slumping as he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my mind racing. As the door to his room clicked shut, I sank to the floor, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me. There was no going back now. Everything had shifted in that moment, and I knew the dynamic between us could never return to what it once was. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the relief of finally acknowledging the tension that had been building for weeks. But the worst part? A small, dark part of me couldn't ignore the way his words had made me feel. Seen. Wanted. Alive. And that realization terrified me. Because no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The morning after was suffocating in its normalcy, a cruel reminder of how life goes on even when your world feels like it's unraveling. I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon, the kind of ordinary, comforting scents that usually grounded me. But not that morning. That morning, they felt like a slap in the face. I went downstairs, my stomach in knots, and found Robert at the table, reading the paper like always. He looked up and smiled. Morning, he said, his voice warm but distracted. Morning, I mumbled, forcing a smile and heading straight for the coffee pot. I felt Sam before I saw him. He was sitting at the counter, staring intently at his phone, his shoulders tense. He didn't look up when I entered, and the space between us felt charged, like a live wire humming just beneath the surface. Sleep okay? Robert asked, oblivious as ever. Yeah, I lied, pouring my coffee with a hand that trembled slightly. Sam didn't say a word. He just sat there, his eyes glued to the screen, his body language stiff and closed off. The silence between us was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity, every glance a potential explosion waiting to happen. I busied myself with small tasks, wiping the already clean counter, rearranging the spice rack, anything to keep my hands moving and my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened the night before. Sam avoided eye contact all day. He kept his distance, retreating to his room or disappearing outside with his skateboard. And while part of me was relieved, another part of me ached at the absence of his usual energy, his playful banter. Robert, as usual, didn't seem to notice. He went about his day as if nothing had changed, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But I noticed. I noticed everything. Every interaction felt loaded, every word carefully chosen to avoid crossing a line that had already been obliterated. At dinner, the tension was unbearable. Sam sat quietly, picking at his food, while Robert tried to fill the silence with small talk about work and the news. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment in the kitchen over and over like a punishment I couldn't escape. Later that night, when Robert was asleep, I found myself sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television. The house was dark and silent, but my thoughts were deafening. I couldn't shake the guilt that clung to me like a second skin. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sam's face, heard his voice, felt the weight of his words. But it wasn't just guilt. There was something else, something darker and more complicated. A part of me that couldn't ignore how alive I had felt in that moment, how desperately I had needed to feel seen. And that terrified me. Over the next few days, the tension in the house became impossible to ignore. Sam and I danced around each other, careful to avoid being alone together. But even in a crowded room, I could feel his presence like a physical weight. Every glance felt like a secret. Every word like a risk. Robert started to notice the shift, though he didn't understand it. "Everything okay?" he asked one evening as we were getting ready for bed. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his brow furrowed. "Just tired," I lied, turning away so he wouldn't see the guilt written all over my face. But I could tell he wasn't convinced. The subtle shifts in our interactions began to ripple through the family. Sam's usual exuberance was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost sullen demeanor. Robert chalked it up to teenage moodiness, but I knew better. Every meal, every conversation, every shared space became a minefield of unspoken words and buried emotions. And the worst part? I didn't know how to fix it. I wanted to go back to before, to pretend that night in the kitchen had never happened. But there was no going back. The boundaries between us had been irreparably blurred, and I didn't know how to rebuild them. The guilt ate away at me, but so did the memory of how it had felt to be seen, to be wanted. And as much as I hated myself for it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The fallout had begun, and I was powerless to stop it. The days blurred into weeks, but the weight of that night in the kitchen never left me. It followed me everywhere, a shadow I couldn't outrun. Each time I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back. "What kind of person have I become?" I whispered one night, sitting alone in the dim light of the living room. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like they belonged to someone else, yet they were undeniably mine. It was easy to blame the loneliness. To tell myself that years of feeling invisible had chipped away at the person I used to be. That the cracks had finally widened enough to let something like this slip through. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was the whole truth. Was it loneliness? Or was it something darker? The questions haunted me, circling my mind in an endless loop. If it was just loneliness, then why couldn't I stop thinking about the way Sam had looked at me? The way his words had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years? And if it wasn't loneliness, then what was it? I hated myself for even entertaining the thought. For allowing those fleeting moments of validation to take root in my heart, even as guilt threatened to smother me. I found myself replaying that night over and over, dissecting every word, every glance, every second. I wanted to believe it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness that would fade with time. But the truth was, it hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown, taking up more and more space in my mind until it felt like there was nothing else. The worst part was the uncertainty of what came next. Should I confess? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I imagined sitting down with Robert, trying to explain the unexplainable. How could I tell him what had happened when I didn't fully understand it myself? How could I expect him to forgive me when I couldn't even forgive myself? And what about Sam? The idea of confronting him, of addressing the tension between us, felt equally impossible. What would I even say? That I understood? That I didn't? That I wanted to forget, to move on, to pretend it had never happened? But even as I considered burying it all deep inside, the weight of the secret felt unbearable. Could I really keep this hidden forever? Could I live with the guilt, the shame, the constant fear that it might one day come to light? Every option felt like a dead end. If I confessed, I risked destroying everything: my marriage, my family, my relationship with Sam. But if I stayed silent, I'd be living a lie, carrying the burden of what had happened alone. And walking away, well, that felt like the most cowardly option of all. I thought about leaving sometimes, packing up and starting over somewhere far away where no one knew me, where I could escape the weight of my mistakes. But even in those moments of desperation, I knew it wasn't a real solution. I couldn't run from myself. The nights were the hardest. When the house was quiet and there was nothing to distract me, the thoughts would creep in, relentless and unforgiving. I'd sit in the dark, replaying that night in the kitchen, the words, the touch, the look in Sam's eyes. I wanted to believe it hadn't meant anything, that it was just a fleeting moment of vulnerability. But the truth was, it had meant something. To both of us. And that was what terrified me the most. Because no matter how much I wanted to move on, to forget, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. That the weight of what had happened would follow me, no matter where I went or what I did. And as I sat there in the dark, the silence pressing in around me, I realized I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to move forward. I didn't know if I ever would. And now here I am, sitting in front of this camera, laying it all out there. I never thought I'd share something like this with anyone, let alone the entire world. But there's something about saying it out loud, about being honest with myself, that feels like the first step toward figuring out what comes next. Have you ever been caught in a moment you couldn't explain? A moment that made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself? I need to know I'm not alone. If you've ever felt the way I've felt, lost, confused, unsure of where to go from here, please share your story in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. Because maybe, just maybe, your words might help someone else too. And if you have advice, anything at all, don't hold back. I'm open to hearing it, even if it's hard to hear. If this story resonated with you, or if you found something in it that made you stop and think, please like this video and consider subscribing. Your support means the world to me, and it helps create a space where we can have these hard, honest conversations. Your advice might just help me figure out what to do next. Loneliness is a strange thing. It creeps in quietly, settling into the corners of your life until one day, you look around and realize it's taken over. It can make you do things you never thought you were capable of. It can make you see things differently, blur the lines between right and wrong, and pull you into places you know you shouldn't go. But here's what I've learned. Some doors are better left closed. If you find yourself standing at a crossroads, staring at a choice that feels both thrilling and terrifying, take a step back. Think about what's at stake, about who you might hurt, including yourself. Because once you cross that line, there's no going back. I wish I could say I know how this ends. I wish I could tie it all up in a neat little bow and give you a satisfying conclusion. But life doesn't work that way, does it? Some stories don't have neat conclusions. Some just linger unresolved, leaving you to wonder what could have been or what should have been. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the lesson isn't in the ending, but in the choices we make along the way. Thank you for listening. For being here. For being part of this journey with me. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And take care of each other.